Awesome. Thank you, Kim. James, did you want to add anything? Before we
No.
get started?
We've been together for a number of years now. I think you kind of had that. I think it's coming up on 10 that we've known each other, and my job has become focused around talking to companies and individuals around security conversations, and so that's kind of Darren and I have some great sort of side conversations where we talk about where we think things are going, and I think that's what we're going to try to focus on today.
Yep. And my background has gone from, I guess, cybercrime investigator. And prior to the Bureau, I was CISO for the Supercomputer Center. So I had the leadership in the past, but now I'm back in that role. I've been with the city for 4 years. Hopefully, between the two of us, we can give everyone a couple different perspectives here.
Right.
So, thanks. To go over the goals and format, and Kim already alluded to this, I want to try to include you folks in the audience as much as possible. So I beg you, normally we say save questions to the end. I beg you, ask questions in the middle. Type them into the chat, please. And we would love to have your involvement. We want this to be steered as a group effort. We're going to cover some of the challenges that we've seen and experienced with IoT, cloud, governance, and the enterprise. And then maybe give a couple examples and then talk about some of the solutions that we've seen. So, James, do we want to switch back and forth here? I mean, I know we went through these, but are you able to?
I'm not seeing it I see it actually in the live room up there on Connor. Oh, there it is. Okay. So yeah.
Technology is hard, I know.
Yeah. I'm like going both ways. So I think what's kind of interesting is Darren and I have we came out of the FBI. Darren went into sort of that security side and as a customer or as an endpoint and that endpoint defense. And what I've tried to do is I've sort of focused somewhat on the technology, but really having more of that general conversation. And I think what we've seen, especially around the COVID changed it all. I mean, you may have heard me say it in the past, but COVID was the largest unplanned IT transformation that we could ever have, because work from home changed how we do business. The trying to stay in business became much more of the challenge than anything else we had. And so what it also saw was the edge changed, and that's kind of the conversation that we've been having is how does that threat picture change? How is the criminal element in all of this changed and transformed as well? And unfortunately, we're not dealing with criminals who are just sitting there static and doing the same bank robbery and over and over and over again. They're innovating. They're creating a different threat picture, and if we don't move with it, then we're finding a lot of times that static defense gets kind of blown over by a new threat picture. Good example is I was just reading an article this morning that hackers are now selling access into graphics card VRAM to avoid being detected by traditional edge devices or host-based intrusion type stuff. So they're leveraging all of your network and all of that, and that's why we see IoT, for example, as a continuing attack surface.
Yep, and I think prior to COVID, at least for most organizations and the one that I'm with, I mean, IoT was the big thing that was hard to get our hands around because we still had somewhat of an edge. Most people came into the office. That was great because it's somewhat manageable. Suddenly this thing called COVID happened, and now instead of having a couple hundred remote workers on any given time, we have thousands of people that are remote working from all over the place. And it really added to the challenge. We had to increase that flexibility and give them more flexibility and more security. And those two, as everyone knows, are they're like polar opposites.
Well, we've also seen it drive a change in the architecture. Because if we look about, you and I have been in IT for 30 years or something, 30 plus, is the old architecture was built in that north-south line where you had a firewall and a border router and all of that, and we expected all of our traffic to have this single traverse point. But now, because the edge is spread, our network is spread, it's fatter, more east-west traffic. And I think Gartner was saying by 2025, 80% of our data will be created at the edge. And then the challenge we have as IT people is how do we move that data from the edge, process it because latency is becoming a question, and then how do we move it into the cloud or move it into data center? So it's changing the way we need to think about architecture, because now everybody's not in our castle, everybody's outside the castle, and so our walls don't do near as much to defend us.
Yep, and we have to get really creative. I know for the city we've had, initially we had everyone moving outside, but yet we were routing traffic back through the internal network via VPN for everything. You can guess what that did to the network throughput and to a lot of the systems. So then we had to get smart, and we routed certain traffic, like the Office 365 traffic. We still are able to monitor it, but we direct it straight from our cloud provider where people are using a virtual desktop environment to Office 365, and that helps deal with that latency. And there's a lot of other solutions that we had to deal with that are similar to that. I mean, it really changed the game. I like the way that, James, that you said, what was the wording you said? COVID was the first,
the largest unplanned IT transformation.
And I think it's funny because a lot of the things that happened during it, everyone was saying, well, we really should allow people to work remote more. We think people are able to do that. There's this cool thing called zero trust. It sounds like that makes a lot of sense. But as with human beings, what motivates us? Unfortunately, I think a lot of times we have to be, right at the edge of the cliff before we react. And in this case, we ended up.
Well, it also becomes somewhat budgetary, with that, because we have our money channeled into particular projects as we move through that fiscal year, and we've got these strategic plans. So we maybe run a 2-year or 5-year plan. And so when something like that comes up, everything has to change. And so your whole budget. And so I think also what happened, we saw some companies sort of came in and said, well, this isn't going to last very long. And so they were slower to react to a long-term thing. So here we are now 18, 20 months into it, and it's still there. And I think we have to just accept that work from home is never going to go away. Now we've opened Pandora's box. People, prior to COVID, I think the numbers were somewhere around 5 to 8% of the workforce worked more than 50% of the time from home. But now that number is in the 55 to 60%, and it's going to settle somewhere between 40 and 45%. It's just people are willing to accept jobs where they can work from home at a lower pay than they are willing to go into the office. And I just think that's the world we live in now.
Yep, I agree. So to keep everyone involved here and to see how participatory this group is, let me move to the next slide. Make sure I'm looking. Is this the right one? Am I seeing it correctly, guys? Question, yes. All right. So we have our first question for the audience. And most of these questions won't necessarily be on the slides. They probably will likely just be directed from one of the two of us. But we want you to answer in the little chat window. What do you feel is the greatest challenge for organizations today with regards to cyber? You don't need to put them all in order. Just pick one that you feel is the greatest. And there isn't a right or wrong answer here, and it may depend on your specific organization. But and then James, since I'm not seeing that, if you could.
Yeah. So Michael just asked a good question. He said, "So what good has come out of the COVID migration?" That's a good question. The good is that
awesome question.
Companies have actually started to see that work from home does work. What's fascinating by that is there was this kind of concern that we weren't able to track our workers. That we weren't able to. Their productivity would be lower. But what we've actually seen is almost the opposite. We've actually seen work from home has actually in some ways increased productivity and increased people being happy with work. So that's an interesting, conversation that we've seen. That's one thing. I think the other thing is that the positive that can come out of it is if, as Darren was saying, is if you can leverage, for example, cloud and use cloud in a better way and make it a more direct connection between your endpoints and your virtual users and the data. It actually can accelerate and we don't have to spend as much as we are spending right now on brick and mortar. It changes some of that conversation about where our costs are.
Yep. I'm already loving this.
HP said, okay, now we're going to define more people as edge workers. That's what they call us, edge workers. So you don't have to be in the office 40 hours a week. You have a limited amount of time. And so I think you're seeing a lot of companies sort of do that and see what kind of cost savings they can't get.
I'm already loving this group, James, because they're really responding a lot. I think to answer my stance on the improvements, I mean, everything James said, of course, you're welcome, James, but also, the cloud has been a big one for us because for prior to COVID, we definitely had a presence in the cloud, but it was more the exception to the rule, and driving it to departments was a challenge. I think now more and more departments are embracing and recognizing. Before we had to really educate them on the strengths of the cloud. And I think a lot of this remote work and just them utilizing the cloud have really opened up their eyes. The other really big thing for us is we had been experimenting with VDI, virtual desktop infrastructure, and it was a struggle to roll it out, truly. And for all the reasons James mentioned, for some of the other things, you have an environment that is working, budget is allocated. We want to move to quote something new, and everyone knows that people love new, not. Mm-hmm. And there was a lot of hesitation. Well, suddenly they needed a secure means, and especially certain departments, we really wanted to keep them in a contained environment, and VDI was the solution. And we've had outstanding success with VDI, and the adoption. I think, well, it's a mixed bag between VPN users connecting through VPN and using approved systems and using VDI from home or other areas. And it's worked out really well. So I think that's been great because that adoption is beneficial to us. Even if we hadn't had so many people decide to work remote immediately, it's so beneficial when someone needs to connect. If we have them in that little VDI framework, we have so much more control. It's almost like a virtual machine in the sense that it is harder for them to break out of it, or for a bad person that's on the system they're connecting from to break into it. But let's go back to the questions. And honestly, this is great. I think as we get further in the slides, James, we're going to be very flexible because we're jumping around and covering them, and that's great. So what were some of the answers? Experience in managing and understanding it. I think we talked a little on that. Account compromise and data protection. Yes.
Yeah, I see like this one about, leadership's engaged, but we don't have the resources to implement change fast enough. And I think that's fascinating. I think, we've often said that, cybersecurity is not about just IT. It's everybody, right? It's the whole company, and the ability to be agile. And I hate that word sometimes because I think it's overused, but how fast can we move forward, and how fast can we, because COVID was a great example of that, where almost overnight, lockdown orders, in California, we were in RSA right before they locked down. And so that change of how we had to change behavior but also try to do it in a way that didn't impact our end user or our employees. Because, Darren's absolutely right. If you change something and it changes the experience for the end user, they freak out. They can't handle it. Think about when you go from a Windows version to a new Windows version. I had people going, I want my old Windows 95 back, when we did the Windows XP. And people were actually deploying a Windows 95, skin just because people couldn't handle XP or 7 or 8. And so we have that challenge that we have to deal with, is how that end user views that change too.
Yep. And I just saw another one that was popped up, which is a pro for MFA adoption is up. And I can't agree more. I came on board with the city 4 years ago. We used MFA, but very limited. One of the first things I pushed was for us to do that. Thankfully, we had that pretty much complete a year before COVID started hitting. It was fortunate. But again, it's the same kind of scenario, right? People don't like change. They don't like, well, why do I have to deal with this different thing? Suddenly, they were more than willing to, because they recognize their need for it, for remote access. And the other benefit is now we have people in other organizations that are sharing with us. They're less vulnerable. So I think there's less of a threat overall.
Well, and CISO yesterday added single-factor authentication as a risk factor. So now they're saying that if you're only going to use a single, authentication method, that is a risky behavior. So I think we have to push forward. I mean, and multi-factor and even passwordless. We're seeing a lot of conversation around passwordless authentication, and I think you're right. COVID is pushing us towards that, especially, not to beat on Colonial Pipeline, but Colonial Pipeline had a administrator account with a single factor authentication that was an old account, and that just shows that vulnerability and how easy it is for somebody to utilize that. And we've got to push forward in that kind of in that kind of vein.
Yep, and I think we can keep jumping, but I just want to look at a couple others too that hit home for me. Is the leadership engagement without the resources. I find that interesting too, James, because, and to me, true leadership engagement equals resources. Now, unless the person that typed that was saying, hey, you know what? They're engaged. We're having trouble finding people. We have the budget in that sense. We have the resources, but we can't find people. Well, we all are in that boat. And that's just, I don't know what to, we don't, if anyone here has a good answer on how to find bodies, let me know. That's one question I can't answer. We can help be champions for the need, but that's a tough one.
I mean, Darren, think about when we were interviewing people for the computer scientist positions in the FBI. How hard was it to fill open recs that we had in the FBI and bring people in? That was almost impossible, especially in certain areas. I started teaching, at cybersecurity, here at a college in Texas, and we have a waiting list. But at the same time, we can't find instructors because it's hard. And so what I would say is I've always encouraged cybersecurity people to turn around and use that expertise to pull more people into this field, because this is one of the, if you're talking about kids in high school and college age, there's a whole lot of opportunity here. And what we have 500,000 open jobs or more in the United States right now in cybersecurity.
Yep. No, I think you hit the nail on the head. One thing that seems to work for us that, isn't new to anyone, but I think we still as an industry or as a group are not doing it as well as we can. And not that we do it that well, but for people like yourself who teach, and I teach as well, that gives us a pool of fresh young talent, I guess. So that helps me bring good people into the city. But we also do a lot with interns, and, there's a lot of students that are dying to get internship opportunities. It helps us, it helps them. And then if they're good, we can hire them on more often than not. So those are just a couple of the things that I know work, other than, paying very high prices for consultants or bring in third-party people. Let's jump on to, I like those comments about the SaaS storing company data or accountability and enforcement of IT controls. Forgive me while I try to read this. Across an infrastructure that consists of BYOD and cloud. Let me jump a couple slides just to make sure we're not missing anything, but we want to hit on those because for me, one of the reasons that we chose the topic we did is the governance for me has been one of the hardest things to implement, and we have finally got it. I don't ever want to say I've got it right because that's like dropping the gauntlet, but I think we've gotten it much better. And no matter how much we have of the fancy technical solutions, if we don't have good governance, it's very, very challenging. But I do hear you, especially with software as a service, because now you have a third party, as this person stated, not only storing my data, but actually oftentimes controlling access to it. We had to put together a nice clean check sheet that goes with our departments and with the vendors and with the Department of IT to review, hey, what are you trying to do here? Okay. Doesn't meet the business needs? Great. And then what about the policies that we have for the city with regards to security? Does it support SAML so we can use two-factor and use our own authentication, and therefore the password complexity and changing is all built in? Or do we have to rely on creating separate accounts somewhere out in the cloud? Is the data encrypted in transit and at rest? And are we the only ones that hold the key? Oh, we're not? The company, the SaaS provider does? If that's the case for you guys, and it is for some of our stuff, I mean, you can't always have that, but you want to see, hey, well, wait a minute. What are you doing to protect those keys for us? I mean, there's advantages and disadvantages to everything. If they have a copy of those keys and they're properly secured and something happens and we mess something up, then we still can get access by calling them. On the other hand,
we're also seeing some changes around that. You talk about software as a service, or unfortunately, Kaseya and SolarWinds sort of changed a little bit of our conversation because we have these companies that we sort of trust to give access and their services into our network, and then unfortunately they were broken into by very determined criminal actors. What we have to also, we're starting to see a change in service level agreement. We're starting to see a change in what we expect from those services that we do give access into our network. We're changing some of that conversation around how do we secure the services now. So it's not just users, it's not just endpoints, it's not just the mobility, it's not just IoT, it's also the services that are accessing our network. So our APIs, are those vulnerable? Well, yes, we've seen some of that. And so I think those are some of those, when you talk about complex environments, and I saw a number of people say, more complex challenges. That's, I think, a complex challenge that we're starting to see is, how do I trust an MSP? How do I trust an MSSP or in a cloud provider, whether a public, private, whatever, where we want to be able to turn over some of that responsibility to a hosting company, but at the same time, it shakes us a little bit and says, is this really safe? Because if something happens, a breach occurs, we are going to be the ones that we have to get called on the carpet, for it. So.
Well, and how do you govern? And how do you govern that? Do you have policies in place that allow you to control and govern the minimum standards for your providers? And all of us, unfortunately, a lot of times you have to make exceptions, but at least you have that overriding policy so that the department or the entity that's making the ask here in San Diego. I mean, what if it's our real estate department? They honestly don't care at all about security. Well, all right, that's not polite to say. They do care, but it's not their priority.
Right.
Their priority is real estate. And can we find the tool that works well for our needs? And they found the perfect tool. Did they consider security? Well, actually, their technical people are pretty good. But it's, that's so common that a department has a completely different focus. They find the tool they like. And then when we look at it, we go, yeah, it looks like it's a really neat tool for what you want to do, but it doesn't do it securely. It's not, doesn't have good reliability or availability or, redundancy for keeping it available. And we have to, take a step back and work with them. So for us, it's the governance thing has become really important. And one trick, and I hope everyone knows this, is that, he who controls the finances controls everything. So, we were able to get some administrative regulations pushed through in recent years, myself and the CIO, that require departments, when they are making purchases that potentially could be IT related, and yes, it's difficult sometimes for that to get sorted out, those have to be flagged and reviewed by IT, by the security team and the appropriate towers. And that really has shed a lot of light on things. But it's also really helped us bring in some of the stuff that I keep seeing you guys typing, and I'm loving it, where, third-party SaaS concerns, and then, hey, SAML, OIDC is the answer to the sprawl of local accounts. I think I alluded to that, but yes, you're right on. I think, otherwise, what happens? Users have their local username and password. They use two-factor to get into the resources of your organization, but then when they're going to access their SaaS resource, do you think they use different usernames and passwords? No.
Well, and so what Trevor says here at the end is the idea of everything's vulnerable. Everything adds risk. So that's one of the problems we talk about governance and shadow IT. Everything I add to the network adds risk. And so if somebody does something sort of on the side, and then they're like, oh, like you were saying, like say your real estate group, they're adding additional services, or they're using a company as a software service, that is going to add risk to the entire enterprise. And so we have to recognize that, and you and I were talking yesterday around things like HVAC, and often you'll see an HVAC, when a building gets built, they want to have access into their controller. And so you'll have this, VPN connection or some sort of connected network through that lets them access it. But could that be then leveraged as an attack against your entire enterprise? Absolutely. So we have to recognize that everything could put a risk. And we as IT, we as security have to know that it's there, first of all. And then once we know it's there, we have to have at least a conversation about how we're going to reduce that risk or mitigate it should something happen.
One of my favorite lines for departments and for city council and for the mayor's office and for anyone else who is questioning when we are saying, we really do need this level of control is if we don't know about it, we can't protect it. And I can't be held responsible for things that I do not know about or that I am not able to access. We want to know about these things. We have tools in place and means. Some of them are automated that detect new things that pop up on our network. On the other hand, if someone brings in their own, HVAC's a really great example, because if they bring in an HVAC device that doesn't connect to our network, but has its own separate network connection somehow, which our processes hopefully will catch the purchase request for that. But if they do that, now they have their own little network. What is the harm? It's not on our primary network. Well, the harm is that can be made into a weapon and used and really harm the name of the city, not to mention whoever the bad guy is using it to attack from. So, it keeps on growing. And
so I have an example on that. So we got called to, so here in Houston, of course, we have the petrochemical companies, and we had a petrochemical company that felt somebody was intruding on their network. And when we went out and started doing the analysis, we realized that they had a data closet that was shared amongst 4 or 5 different companies, and it wasn't protected. And so one switch was to one company and one switch was to another company, and some of them weren't labeled very well. And so really what ended up happening was that another company went in and plugged in another switch to the wrong switch and created created a tunnel out of the network and it was all a mess, because it brought into question, well, what kind of, did you not have like sticky ports or some sort of even simple security built into your switches? And they didn't. They had no policy built into the security at the edge of their network. And so this network was able to plug in, get an IP address, and actually get out through their network. And it just shows that, unfortunately, sometimes those shared locations can be an issue. And so security has to be built all the way down to our edge devices, all the way down to the edge of our network, all the way down to the edge of whether it's BYOD, whether it's IoT. Every device, we have to be able to first recognize it and then identify its traffic. And so one thing we talk about is traffic flows and how to identify those.
I want to ask the audience another question I just thought of, and James, if you want to tweak it, feel free. But it's non-centralized IT. Instead of saying, "Is it a problem for you all?" Because if you're like me, you'd be like, maybe yes, maybe no, but I'm not commenting. Is it a problem? How big a problem is it for industry, do you think? On a scale of 1 to 10, put it in there. For us, I don't even want to give it a number. I'm scared to, but I think for industry, it certainly appears to be pretty darn high. I know a lot of organizations that have departments running their own little micro IT. And like James was alluding to, even in the same company of multiple departments in the same closet, IT isn't aware of what's going into that closet. So I'd really be interested to see your thoughts on that too, on a scale of 1 to 10.
And I saw this in like the universities. So we had some very large universities here in the area, and one in particular, the CISO of the university had no ability to enforce security policy to the departments. So there were actually 10 or 12 fiefdoms. Each one had their own budget. Each one had their own connection out. But when something happened, that university gets tagged. So they'd say, the University of blah had a breach. Well, nobody cares that the regents don't care at that point in time if it was a breach in the engineering department or in the microbiology lab or whatever. Their university suffered a breach, and so they had a real hard time getting any sort of centralized governance because of that, the way they created this organization, and that's a challenge. It can be very difficult when things go bad, because like for us, when I was still in the FBI, who do I talk to get access to that data? We go to the CISO for the university, and you go, oh, you have to talk to the engineering department CISO. Okay, so we go to the engineering department CISO, and they're like, well, we don't want you to touch it. So then you get into this. So now we go for search warrants. It just gets ugly, and so I can only imagine how difficult it was. And that particular CISO, I think he left that job after about 2 years because he said, I can't run this. So.
Someone said, what kind of nonsense is that where the CISO can't enforce the security policy? I can tell you from my years at the Bureau, working hundreds of intrusion cases across everything from state, federal, local, commercial business, defense contractors, large, very important government organizations, that it's very common nonsense. I agree with the statement that it's nonsense wholeheartedly. But unfortunately it's very, very common. I think that the answer to the centralization thing too is really good. And thank you guys for being so interactive. But it varies from 9.5 plus, so it's unbelievably large problem. But even the lowest numbers I'm seeing are 6s. It certainly is a big issue for all of us. And we can enforce security policy, but then I liked what your example was, James, and it's very important. And for me, it's very important in my role, and I've had good success with this, is that you communicate. First of all, your departments need to know that you're their advocate, that you understand what business needs are, and that those are as important, if not more important, than security. And I can't believe I just said that during a security talk. But if you can't do your business, what security is useless. But then the other thing is for those departments to understand what you alluded to, James, which is, I can't tell you how many times I've heard, and not just in the city, but in other jobs, and I've heard from peers too, hey, this isn't on the corporate network. This isn't on the city network. This isn't on the university's main network. This is just a lab. So even if it gets hacked, it doesn't matter. And James, you did a great job of summarizing, really. Even if it's something small and it's in part of your organization, if it gets hacked and is used to attack whoever, and that gets out, it's going to, at a minimum, it's going to hurt your reputation. But it also could cost you an awful lot of money. The other organization could come after you, and it's just a headache. So, what I tell people is all of these things.
It's important.
Yeah, go.
Security officer has to be given the authority to do what they need to do. It's important this is where executives come in, right? So the executives have to give that responsibility of governance and say, listen, we want you to do this, but if you do this and say, but then if I interviewed as a job for a CISO, I'd be like, what is the limit of my scope? What can I do? And I think as Trevor's saying over here, if it's not good for me, then I leave, I walk. I have to vote with my feet. And that company is eventually going to realize, hopefully, you say hopefully, that if they keep not having people stay in that job, that maybe the problem isn't these people that are taking the job, but maybe it's the lack of scope or lack of responsibility that I'm giving them. I got to also be willing to give that security officer the right to enforce that policy, and what are the teeth that policy offers.
Yeah, I agree. And forgive me, folks, for looking down periodically as I have thoughts and James is talking, or you guys are sharing. My mind sometimes goes off, so I want to make sure I document them and can come back. It's a different format than I'm used to when I'm speaking, but I love this format. But I think, James, you nailed it. Ultimately, it comes down to, and for the person who said, what kind of nonsense, what was the gentleman's name again, James?
That's Trevor.
Trevor, right on. I think that's the question, maybe not in those terms, that you need to ask the executive or your board or your, in my case, the leadership team, and say, hey, you know what? I can tell you right now that I'm only going to take responsibility for that which you give me the ability to control. And so if and when something gets compromised, and I have asked for previously that something be under our control, that we be able to enforce the policies, and it was declined, I can tell you right now, for me, I have to make that decision between, do I walk, which in general for me is no, I'm not going to walk, but I'm going to push for them to accept that, hey, wait, do you guys want to accept that risk then? Because I can't accept it if you don't let me. And more often than not, when I push back, whether it be a fellow exec or it be a department director, they come back and they go, well, we're not going to accept that. And I go, well, then we're in agreement here. You need to allow me to enforce the rules.
And I think, and this last one's Gordon's comment. You're absolutely right. That's why it's really important that security is all the way up the chain. It has to be something that the CEO and the CIO and everybody agrees to and recognizes that this is not an IT issue. This is a corporate risk issue. It is a legal issue. Just yesterday, a couple of days ago, the SEC fined a company, Cambridge, $750 million, I think it was, for not following good security governance policy. I mean, we're seeing more of that. Privacy law, especially like in California, for example, the CCPA is changing some of that because, if you lose the data, you may find yourself held accountable by the county or by the state. That's going to happen more and more states are passing those same kind of laws. We saw Virginia just passed one recently, and I think Colorado did as well.
I think we're finally, and I've said this before in my 25 plus years, so I don't know, we'll see. I think we're finally hitting critical mass to where people are not just giving it lip service, including our government, including the state folks, to where they're actually putting dollars out and they're requiring security to be included in a lot of things. And really, I don't know, I joke with people that security is like backups, unfortunately. Anyone who's ever had to run backups back in my sysadmin days 20 years ago, I say they should be called restores, because if you can't restore them, it doesn't matter if you backed it up. Unfortunately, backups fail and everyone loses their mind. And then 2 weeks after that, whether things got recovered or not, they may have fired someone, but they kind of put backups back on the back burner. And unfortunately, it seems like that's what's happened with security. And for all of us, one of the solutions, like we've talked about several solutions so far today, I think, better governance, more buy-in from the executive team. We'll go into a couple more technical solutions, I think, James, with a little bit of time we have left. But, along with all of that, we also have to make sure that we are able to communicate that need, and we are able to show why it is so important, and keep, give that strength. Like I know with the city, they might ask, why is this one thing? Why are you driving this home so much? And I saw the comment while I was talking right now about it's always a fine line between mission and business objectives. I completely agree. And I think that's know where the jewels are, protect them accordingly. When you talk about the fire department's computer-aided dispatch on our network, or, well, slightly off our network, actually, because it's secluded, or the PD's computer-aided dispatch, do we treat our entire network the same? Heck no. And you have to know that. You have to prioritize. Unfortunately, one of the things that seems to be a common theme, and I know we saw it back in our previous life, James, is that's still the exception to the rule a lot of times. You and I
talked about this before. I mean, I've said, for example, having a good data classification program. All data is not created equal. If it's mission critical data, if it's it's business objective data, like say 911 services, if it's critical infrastructure, that requires a different level. And I think what we've done over time sometimes is tried to protect the entire network the same way, and I don't think that works. I don't think our budgets can handle that, and so we have to start knowing the silo that's important. And I can't tell you the number of times I went out to companies that have been hit by a ransomware attack or a data breach. And I asked two questions. I said, number one, show me your network. And every time they said that, they didn't have an updated network drawing, because it's just the changes were happening. Number two, I said, what data and where is that data stored that is so critical to your company that somebody would want it? And they'd be like, well, we don't have any data like that. What are you talking about? I mean, and I think the problem we have with the criminal mindset is we think criminals are stealing the data to sell the data. That's not necessarily their plan. Their plan is to steal the data and then make you pay to get it back, or prevent it from being made public. And so we have to understand the criminal mindset is not about what. Yeah, like I went to one. It was an HVAC company, They're like, why would somebody want to steal anything from us? I said, you're misunderstanding the purpose of this attack. This attack is to deny you access to your data, so you'll pay to get it back. And they're like, oh. And so that's what we have to recognize is you need to know what your data is and then protect it differently based upon how important that data is to your corporate environment.
And I think that's part of where I have found the best success is conveying that I understand that. And again, you guys heard me mention business need, and I'm seeing again, I love, Philip, your comment is great, where you talk about it's walking that line again. But I mean, if I come in, and I remember we were working on some PCI things, which if anyone knows anything about payment card, it is one of the least flexible security standards. If you miss the mark on anything, you're not compliant. And one company that we were working with was proposing that we basically make the entire city's environment PCI compliant. And I was like, I can't even think of an analogy, but that doesn't make sense. And finally it came to me, I said, look, because anything I say, they're saying, well, you don't want the city secure? I'm going, of course I do. And, but at that line, for me, the way I described that line was, it's like a hospital, okay? When we go into a hospital, it's more secure in the sense that it has a higher cleanliness, it has better controls in place than the outside world or than our homes, hopefully. But the entire hospital is not an operating room. And what I was saying is our PCI environment has to be the operating room. It has to be almost perfect. Unfortunately, that's great for that specific need, but it's hard to do business in that environment. So we need to know where the operating rooms need to be and where the just general hospital has to be. And I don't know if that's the best analogy, but it seemed to hit home for everyone. They went, okay, we get it. We get why we have to move this stuff onto a separate network segment that's very special and hard to access and difficult to work with sometimes.
Well, and to Philip's point, one of the biggest places we see that impact and that security versus mission and business objectives is in the OT networks. When we're looking at, oil and gas companies and stuff like that, where they're OT networks, security often takes a back door. It just has to, because I'm not allowed to take that device offline to put a patch on it, for example, right? Until I'm able to take that generator offline in an electric production plant, something like that. So yeah. OT networks are often one of the biggest places we see security and mission butt heads, and it's almost always in the operations room, and it's almost always the answer almost always goes to business first. It goes to mission first before security. So it's a constant conversation.
Yep. And Gordon's comment is right on. I put this up here because I love the little comic, but I mean, is there an edge anymore? I think we've covered that pretty thoroughly. My question would be, even beyond the edge, what about these quote separate networks? Does that really exist? Does an air gap network exist? And James, from your days in the Bureau, going out to highly sensitive networks, to power or companies or other critical infrastructure, did an firm edge exist all the time?
No, a firm edge never exists. And the problem, everything's too fluid. That's our problem, is everything's too porous. Our edge is mobility, our edge is IoT, our edge is OT, our edge is our workers, our edge is our customers. And all of these things are all interacting differently. And that's, I think, when we talk about complex environments. The world that we live in is going to continue to be complex unless we have a better idea of how to manage it. So treating the edge probably different than anything else might be a mistake. Every device on our network should be treated as a possible risk to our network.
And now you're answering what I was about to ask next, which is, we said we start presenting more solutions. We've given solutions along the way, but what are some of the things that you've seen people do that helps them succeed across any of these problems? And Philip, again, I'm loving this group, the honesty and the openness. He said, Philip says, I work in industrial manufacturing as well. Huge problem. Also, the patches aren't qualified. I could go into we could have a whole talk just on the fact that so many critical systems, we have such, we either have no governance or too much governance, and it's not really in the right place. If we're governing the patch process so thoroughly that the system that you're using can't be patched because we can't get the patches blessed, so therefore we leave it vulnerable. Is that really better than shortcutting the vetting process for a patch? I can't answer that always, but I mean, I'll tell you, GovCloud, and anyone use it? We use both. Sometimes when we're using GovCloud, we have problems because a security thing that we want to use is available in the regular cloud, but the GovCloud version is not there. Yeah. So which is more secure? Well, GovCloud. I think it depends.
In a previous life, in 1994-95, I was a system administrator for a switching system for space and missile control when I was in the Air Force. And we had a whole separate lab environment set up, and we had to do recession testing or regressive testing for 30 days before we could deploy the patches. So the company would deploy a patch, we'd put it into our test environment, and spend 30 days beating on it to see if it would do the same thing. But that was a very stovepipe system. It was a system specifically designed around one mission. And so it's harder, I think, sometimes when we look at a system that's more publicly available. And then Darren absolutely alluded to it. We saw this even in our time in the FBI, where
we can't confirm or deny.
We can't confirm or deny it. Where there'd be a software version of a forensics package, and then the version that was available to the general public was 4 generations ahead of what we were authorized to use because of our rules and our policy that was in place. So that's another place where policy often impacts. It's really nice to have this feature, but we're not going to get to it anytime soon. And that's, I think, the other thing we see a lot in these environments is people will see what's available publicly and say, why don't we have this here now? It's like, well, we have a different set of rules, and that's the world that we live in.
So I've given up on the slides in case you haven't noticed altogether, and I'm glad I was able to. Thank you all. I think, James, do we want to try to, I don't know how much time we have. I think we're getting a little close, but do we want to start?
There it is.
10 minutes. Do we want to start? And I'd love the audience to give, this audience is very shy, not at all. But I would love to have input from everyone, including, you and I, James, but also the audience on, hey, what are we doing that's succeeding to help remedy these issues? I mean, for me, I've named some of them, right? VDI for remote access is really helpful. There's all kinds of cool technologies that are really good. AI,
I'm machine learning, like user behavior analytics. We're seeing a lot of that. That's coming out because the impossible travel and monitoring people, and everybody has a certain behavior set that they normally follow. And so sometimes behavioral analytics can help identify unusual behavior of a particular user. So I think that's getting a lot of growth. Machine learning for patching purposes, for example. So machine learning can look at patches for, let's say you have 5 different products on your network. And sometimes if I patch this product, it now doesn't work with product 2. And so recognizing some of that, it's like drug interactions. It's really like the same idea is maybe version 2.0 is not the right thing to do until the version of this software gets up to a certain level and I can maintain, because again, patching is great, but if I take only a black box approach and patch each individual box, does that box now work with box 2, box 3, box 4, box 5? Oh, it doesn't. Well, then I have to go back. And that's just something we should know ahead of the game.
Yep. Do you guys have anything that we haven't covered? I mean, I know there is not a silver bullet for this. I know defense in depth is still true. I know that basic hygiene is still one of our biggest problems. And in my opinion, if you can even just take care of those 2 things, the majority of hacks that I saw when I worked for the Bureau, and I saw hundreds and read about even more, but I worked hundreds of cases. The vast majority weren't some novel, crazy, they were targeted even by big name organizations and foreign actors and APT, but the vast majority, they weren't like some ingenious new thing. They were taking advantage of the fact that someone just did not do basic hygiene. They weren't able to monitor or manage their network. They didn't have control of everything that was going on. They left an RDP server sitting out in the wind that was also plugged in. But
and Tony's point here is spot on. It's critically important to make sure that the C-suite and even the board of directors has a good awareness of the threat, and knows how that threat could affect their company. That's why, for example, I talk to people having a good risk validation done, or a penetration test done, that then can grade different aspects of security within your environment. I'll tell anybody that's where you should start. Before you talk to any tech company, you should know what your risk is and what that would look like. Then there's some cool products out there that could show you what a breach would look like. They would simulate a breach and show you, okay, so if you don't fix this, here's what that would look like. And being able to take that kind of a package back to the C-level or back to your board and saying, this is what happens if I don't patch that. That scares the pants out of them, because it's a resume generating event, right? And boards don't like it. It's reputational damage. It affects the stock price if it's a publicly held company. They don't want to go in that direction. They have to make sure,
And if you're not using a BAS, a breach attack simulator product, I can't recommend it enough. I can tell you that the San Diego Port Authority a couple of years ago, I think it's that long ago now, it might still be like a year and a half, but whatever, they had a major breach, and it was SamSam, okay, ransomware. And, as soon as I found that out early on, because I know the people over there, and, of course, once it got publicized and it was happening, I'm hearing from all the other executive teams, I'm hearing from the mayor's office, Darren, are we protected? Well, the nice thing is, and I'll give a free plug to them, we use a company called Attack IQ. They're great. There's other ones that are great too. But using that system, I was able to test my team, and they already had a pre-canned, neutered version of that exact malware that I could now push out to machines on my network and see if our endpoint security detected it, to see if my team reacted to the alerts. And then did it beacon back, and it used the cryptographic technique, but it didn't actually encrypt the data. It also, did it beacon back out to known bad? No, it beaconed back out to me and told me that it was successful. And those are great. And like James, what's your name again? No, like James just said, the real key there for me was early on when I started with the city, the CISO had as needed briefings with, council members or the mayor. One of the things that we've implemented, and they were happy to have it, actually, I guess it probably helps or is bad, but it helps that there's been so many incidents, and now is a good time for all of you, for anyone in our industry. If you're not getting that FaceTime and it's not a part of your policies, that the CISO or security director or whatever the title is will brief the executive team, the board members, the council, the chief poobah, at least annually, if not more, and then as needed and recommended by the CISO themselves. That's something that would cause me to walk. That's one. It takes a lot, because usually I can say, okay, I don't agree with this, but we can mitigate the risk, or I can let them know that, hey, if something happens, it's not going to be on me because I have the documented emails. But that's the one that would make me walk, because you have to be able to let them know and share that. We have 5 minutes left, I just saw. Do we want to open it up to just any old random questions or summary? I mean, for me, the big things are, again, back to basics, governance, treat everything like it's unsafe. So, zero trust, and use the new technology, but don't rely on any single technology. There's other peers I have out there that rely on a single vendor for all of their solutions. James, it works for a vendor. And he and I were talking about this, and he's like, nope.
Well, and I would say incident response plan, have one and test it. 75% of companies have an incident response plan and never tested it. You need to know how you're going to react when something goes bad. Backup, disaster recovery plan. And I thought what Darren said is spot on. They're not backups. They should be recoveries. You need to test your backups. 75% of backups will fail when you need them. So you've got to know that you're backing up what's critically important to your company and can recover you back to what is basic business. When Colonial Pipeline, I was watching the CEO testify before Congress, and he said when they got hit with the virus, he made the decision within the first hour or two to pay the ransom. What that told me is that he didn't have enough faith in the backups or wasn't aware that his backups could have prevented or brought him back to normal. Yep. It's we as security officers, as IT people, have to make our bosses, our CEO, our executives completely comfortable that I will be able to recover you back to wherever you were immediately or within X amount of time. We have to be able to say that. And if we're not, then why are we paying all the money for these backup, products? So
it's your reserve parachute, right? When I was in college, I skydived. You jump, you go to pull that first parachute, and it's anxiety provoking, at least for me. You watch it unfurl and you hope it opens correctly, but you have that reserve. You don't want to test that reserve. The nice thing about backups is you can test that reserve.
Yep.
And you have
I've said all along, come in on a weekend, do it, and especially if you've got a test bed, like Darren was saying, recover to the test bed, see if it brings you back to what is a minimum need to get back into business. But there should be no reason why you don't know. If you don't, then that's going to be on you.
And I think we're good to wrap. I mean, again, thank you guys a lot. I enjoyed the format of this. It's definitely different for me to be bouncing back and forth and making my little notes so I remember to key on what you guys have been typing, but I appreciate the interaction. James, it's always fun doing something like this with you. And Kim, thank you for having us. Any closing comments, James?
Nope. I just want to say the same thing. So be glad to be able to see you in person again,
In person, sort of.
Yeah, well, after a few beers, right?
Hey, there you go.
All right.
All right. Thank you, everyone.